So welcome, Shekar.
Thank you, Nan. Love to be here with you and your audience.
Shekar, you're a fellow with the American Academy of Housing and Communities. And with your background, it's well deserved. With your involvement in so many areas, what stands out as your biggest contribution to housing and communities?
Nan, you find yourself often in life, sometimes in positions where you can do things you didn't dream of. And I found myself in that position many times, really, in the last 25 years. I have never run for office. I have not been in public service in the literal sense as a full-time employee, and I've done these commissions and boards, but never that. And so with the combination of those, yet I've had a bully pulpit. I've had a place where I could talk about issues credibly, amazingly, actually had people listen to me, which I find remarkable always when people go, oh my God, I'm listening to him. And so I've used that as the way to say, as a private sector person with a heart, with some knowledge, with some credibility, what is the importance of housing as a sort of a cornerstone for human existence? And that's what I've done. And so I feel really good about the use of that. And I think more people in the corporate sector and in the business sector that can do that and then act on it. And the actions are really occurring through many of the vehicles, not often just done by me, but through organizations that I work with or sit on the boards of.
Well, you're a co-founder of the Remergent Communities Fund. So tell us a little bit about what it is, why you founded it, and why it's important to you.
So this is going to have to be a short story because it can be a very long story. But I came to this country as an immigrant and very young, naive, probably fairly idealistic. I think hopefully all of us are at the age of 21. Ended up having done an engineering degree and an MBA working in Eastern Kentucky. And that little history of 4 years living in rural Appalachia, working on housing issues, working with very little, except recognizing the importance of government and the intersection between government and nonprofits. That little history led really to a whole dimension in my life about housing. The importance of it, the need for it, the need for government, but also the role of the private sector. But the one thing I learned through that was that we have many, many communities in the United States, particularly in the last 25 years, that have just been left behind. The disparities in the allocation of capital in America is actually so vivid. I think if I just told you this, there are only 5 cities in the United States that get 90% of all venture capital. There are literally even fewer that get the kind of seed capital for re-emergence, which is why we use the word re-emergent. And what happens is these communities fall apart for some reason, like they're one industry dependent. So we had the departure of textile plants, furniture plants, tobacco farming. We've had, and now one can't say these are bad because they are inevitable. There's some inevitability to what happens in change. Coal mining goes down because it was a difficult thing to do. It was expensive. And then you went to strip mining, which may have all kinds of environmental consequences. But industries change over time. When they do, communities just get left behind. But what we thought was, look, based on the experience I've had, other people have had, and the partners we brought in, there was a sense that there were some communities that had the basic infrastructure, political will, and the pride that would enable them to revitalize. The question on the table was, were they located in a place where some growth was possible? Because the number one driver, I always say this, and it sounds so obvious, right? How do you know a community is declining? Factor number one, young people leave. That's it. It's that simple. If you look at a community and you see communities aging consecutively, that means that even though there are young people, at 8th grade, they've essentially made the decision, or their parents have for them, you're going to have to leave here to see opportunity. Those communities are in decline. So what can you do to arrest it? So we came up with a thesis that we said, look, let's do a data-driven approach to this, figure out which communities we can work in, which have these 5 or 6 essential ingredients of success. There's a lot of risk associated with it because we're probably going to be the first private sector capital investor in these communities in 25 years, quite possibly. So you can just imagine the eyebrows being raised in the typical private real estate equity arenas. Sure. But we did some experiments, some pilots. My partners at Rivermont had done quite a bit of work in Durham. They had a 13-year history doing this. And we did the data-driven work. We then started to use a term that I love to use, which is called private-public partnerships. And the reason we use that as opposed to public-private is that the question is who is driving the change? Not who's bringing the money to the change, but who's driving the change. The driving of the change should occur with the participation of community, with private sector risk money saying, what if we did this? And I'll tell you the hypothesis in a sentence. If you build a vibrant downtown that attracts young people back to raise their families, you will re-energize a community. That's how revitalization works. So what does it take to do that? It takes a place that has some growth potential, where job creation is on the cards, a community that already has pride, that has decided, I don't want to just be a bedroom community. I can have my own raison d'etre for existence. When you have communities like that, and when you look at the opportunity set and say, if I just started to plan this out, and then the final ingredient of success is long-term patient money. Communities that decline over 20, 25 years because they lost one major employer. Kannapolis, North Carolina, 18,000 jobs one day. Danville, Virginia, 12,000 jobs on one day. One major industry just whoops, and the town gets shelled out. Well, how do you bring them back? 10-year to 15-year project with the revitalization of a downtown, a complete resurgence in terms of the kinds of jobs and skill training and the connection to education, and then housing that then allows more affordability than if people lived elsewhere. Once you have done that, you will have not only a revitalized community, but we can bring back a whole lot of small town America. And we can spread, if you will, this energy and this largesse that this country has, not just its natural resources, but its talent across the nation. Now, let me conclude by saying COVID has taught us some lessons. Most of them have not been pleasant or frankly, have not been good for most of our mental health. But the one good lesson it has taught us is you can work and live pretty much anywhere and do a substantial part of what you do, as long as you're living in a community or a neighborhood where you have family and support, you have great broadband accessibility, and you can live in an affordable home. So why don't we just take those 3 lessons and make it available to every American in the next 10 years?
Shekar, tell me, have any of those cities been redeveloped, let's say, long enough for you to get any statistics on population, on housing that was built, anything you could track for us?
Sure. So I think we always use the example of Durham. We use the example of cities that have made it, like Chattanooga, vibrant mayor, great, infrastructure, a rail town that had to convert to becoming more technology driven. But when I think of small cities, I'm thinking of cities hitting 50 to 200,000 that don't necessarily have a Duke University, for example, as an anchor. I'm thinking of places that have some infrastructure, some capacity, some community. So we're doing the harder places, frankly. We're doing places like Wilson, North Carolina, and Danville, Virginia, and Fayetteville, North Carolina. We're doing places, yes, have we got developments? Have we already made investments? Are we already active in 5 communities? You bet. But we have only been in one place for long enough, 18 months, that interestingly, I mean, people are writing case studies about this stuff already, Nan, but I will tell you that I don't view any proof yet. I think our proof will come within 5 years. So another 3 years, give us 3 years. Let us look back at then what we saw, education levels, job salary levels, the increase in young people. Typically we're saying under 35, and the maintenance of affordability in housing. But it's tied to this broadband access and all these other issues. So are we in the process? Yes. Have we got proof of concept? Not yet. Do we believe it can work, generate a very strong return for the investors and generate a return for the communities? Yes. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it.
I guess we better make a date in 3.5 years then and talk about it.
Yes, because I think we could do this across America. And one of the things we will do is do a study, do an analysis that's a little bit more scientific, because we like to say we are data-driven. Well, then let's just use the data. But the cities we're in are making huge investments. They are putting their money where their mouth is. They are agreeing to. I was in one city recently within the last 7 months, and we happened to have a New York pre-COVID, and we happened to have a New York developer with us who was thinking of investing with us. And so he was asking some more traditional type of questions, saying, oh, I see that empty lot. I think we've got an option on it. When are you going to start developing it? How long does it take to do the plans and permitting? Because in New York, it can take it 2 years, 3 years, whatever. And the city manager, this young, energetic young guy is sitting in front of us, and he says, it took us 6 weeks last time, but we think we can shorten that. This guy must have slid off his chair and gone under the table. So he thought it was 6 weeks, 6 months. But no, they were so proud of the fact that they were a partner. There was no antagonism. I know what you're going to do. We already have a plan. We know who you are. Let's work together and get this done. So the kind of typical barriers you find in large cities with the desire for impact fees, the desire for, let's do this more methodically. There's so much competition. We don't find those. Now, we hope that, by the way, in a year and a half, 2 years, when we talk again, that we have proof. Not only are the projects we're doing working, but is the community rebuild happening? Is the young people return? Is the education level? Are the salaries and incomes going up? I think the answer is we're going to see it very quickly, but we want to have proof. We then want to make some best practices and write them up. One of my partners in this is Enterprise Community Partners, because we want to be able to publish this and say to other communities, to other mayors, and there are others who are doing this and want to do this. This is a way that we did it. Some things we learned, some lessons we learned, negative and positive. Because again, just think about equitable growth, think about social justice, think about racial inequality. It doesn't get addressed unless we make all Americans everywhere there is opportunity, the ability to access that opportunity. That's what we're trying to do in this very small little experiment that we have started with this Opportunity Zone Fund.
Where are they likely to get the public funds? Is it from HUD's Community Development Program, or where are they getting that?
Good point. We have always said that governors need to engage, because some of the funds come through the state. Very often they're federal funds, but still they're directed by the state. And then the cities themselves, if they are part of larger counties or multi-county jurisdictions, need to be able to access them. So typically the sources have been, yes, you're right, CDBG, home, economic development grants like EDA, but also transit funds that they've gotten. We've been very careful. We need community, we need transportation. You have to have access to job centers. If until the job centers move to where you are, because it makes so much sense where the talent is, right? Takes a while. But I can tell you that in 2 cities that we went into within the last 12 months, 2 employers have announced huge expansions involving 500 jobs each. And now it won't happen overnight, but now we've got to start thinking of housing, support systems, infrastructure, the education. But the cities are just so excited. They're like, let's go, let's go. What do we need to do? How do we revitalize that block? How do we take care of this? So it'll happen with limited resources that are going to be available here in the near term. The good news is that in all 5 communities, we're kind of locked in the plan. We have our first deals underway. And in every single case, we found partners, local and developers, who are putting skin in the game with us. And institutions now. Think about this. Private capital leads, public sector supports, and when you get to a certain scale, you can then go to the guys who are skeptical and say, it's getting done, it's moving. What do you think now? Now we have de-risked it for you. We have given you a project, if you want to call it that, which I hate to do, because I always think of community and home. I'd rather not think of projects. But anyway, so here it is. This is the deal. And now you can underwrite the deal. And because we have very strong impact metric, we have very strong focus on affordability, many institutions are coming and saying, well, what's your return? Which makes sense. And when we can talk to them about the kind of returns we can give them, the answer has been much more positive today than it was a year and a half ago. So we're making inroads. And I just think, look, we got to prove the thesis. And we will prove it through COVID and post-COVID, so we can then again point to, we had this major, black swan pandemic event, and it still happened and it still worked. Maybe things got delayed by months, but it still worked.
You serve as chairman of Papillon Capital. What does sustainable infrastructure investing involve?
So we came up with this. This project is 9 years old. So it's another one of my, oh my God, I got you get an epiphany, right? 2 a.m., I start writing down, what are the 5 basic human needs? Food, shelter, health, energy, and education. If I can find entrepreneurs in those sectors who are motivated socially, yes, but believe they can create a business and create a product and service to serve their communities, whichever communities they're in, around the world. And I could do this in emerging markets. And some of these companies became sustainable, meaning they were actually profitable, they employed people, they paid fair wages, and they lasted more than 3 or 4 or 5 years. Wow. That would be a sustainable infrastructure. Infrastructure, when I use that term, isn't about bricks and mortar, it's about people and companies. Private sector companies that have legs, that have scalability. So we identified within these 5 sectors 4 companies, all of them in emerging markets. And we made investments, early stage investments. I'm pleased to say one of them, the one in alternative energy that was in biomass and in small hydro grids, which was in Uganda and Sri Lanka, has essentially paid off already. But it's 9 years. Okay, so remember the talk about, if you want to make real change, it takes a whole lot of time and lots of passion. The second that may not work is in affordable housing in India, where we were using rapid panels to build. COVID has put a serious dent into the idea of building a factory and manufacturing there locally. Perhaps it'll turn around, but I wouldn't bet on it. The education one was well ahead of its time, which was a tablet that didn't need internet, where you could actually lock it into an entire curriculum for a whole, like 8th grade, that was being used in Hyderabad, India. You took it home, so you didn't need to have internet. You could read everything on the tablet. You could even finish your homework. You could come into school. It could get uploaded. to the internet, to the cloud, and the teacher could do the scoring at home. Idea was save time, save energy, and show children in 8th grade and so on how you could use automation and computer skills. Way ahead of its time. They had to build a backbone for it. They got acquired by a larger company. We are not sure whether that will ever scale, but hopefully we'll do okay in terms of our economics. The last one, which is likely to be the home run, is in medicine. And it started with a social entrepreneur from the United States who had done really well, going back to his hometown in India and discovering that the single biggest problem was the number of early childbirth deaths at birth. And the reason that that children were dying at birth, babies was because the mother didn't know that there were likely to be complications. And so they were using midwives and cesarean, and they were not succeeding. They had to go to a hospital for that birth. So he said, why? It's so easy. We can simply do a little scrub DNA test, and we can tell there are likely to be complications, tell you well in advance, organize you to go to a hospital and have your child. But how do you get the test? How do you get it to the person? How do you get the result? How do you get the person to agree to come? And then how do you organize this entire last mile access kind of thing? So he took it on to build a DNA database in India. And it's now one of the largest and most robust in South Asia. And it has gravitated from this solution, which is how do you get rural poor women to improve the chances of childbirth and childbirth that's healthy, to Alzheimer testing, and even in COVID, how it can be used to improve the efficacy of drugs and so on. So that company has now raised 4 or 5 major rounds of capital. We were early with the inventors, if you want to call them that, before even they built the lab. We just bet on 2 fantastic entrepreneurs, one who still lives in the US and one who lives in India, but both of whom very successful, that we just bet on. And look, the idea was if you invest in these companies, they do well, we do well, everybody does well, but most importantly, it served a human need that would not have been served otherwise. And these companies, if they're around, by the way, all 4 companies are around in 9 years later after we made our investments. That itself is true. Most social enterprises that come with well-minded people don't last more than 3 to 4 years because they fail to scale and they don't get the right support systems. I think we've done a few things right, a few things wrong. We never took this to the next level. But my goal fundamentally in all of these ventures is how do we find a way to create more inclusive societies, more people who can participate in a system so that it becomes fairer? Because if we do that, we actually use all of human potential, and particularly with women.
Shekar, as long as we're talking about India, let's talk a little bit about Indiaspora. That was a nonprofit organization founded by community leaders to unite Indian Americans and transform their success into meaningful impact in India and on the global stage. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. There are so many people who are just great at organizing things. And one of them is my friend M. Rangaswamy. We just call him MR. MR does all these things where he brings people who are in the same general sectors together and organizes events. And it's usually pretty agenda free. There's no objective, meaning you don't want to end up with a conference that says, I have agreed to the following 3 action items. It's more about if you put the right people in the room and you have a very big agenda, let them decide how they leverage themselves with each other, especially if they don't know each other or only have heard of each other. So what he did several years ago was organize an event where he called 20 people and said, would you agree to come for 2 days and just talk about Indians, because we are in business, in all kinds of cultural activities and so on in the United States, but we haven't leveraged ourselves, particularly as a global diaspora. Plus, the facts were then and now that many people have one leg in their country of birth. And so they continue to invest in those countries as I have and others have, but they neglect where they are today, where their children are and their grandchildren are. So we said, how can we make sure that everybody knows charity begins at home, number one, and leverage that into engagement across many platforms, not just political, but civic engagement being equally important. So he did this conference in upstate New York. 100 people got together. So it was the circle of circles. And everybody thought, oh my God. And it was this broad swath of people, young, old. And, at that conference, by the way, there weren't enough women, just so you know. And the striving for now is to have at least 50% women. But he asked me after that conference, what did you think? And I said, there was something very exciting about it because I met so many people who are eclectic and different than me, but share so much of the same value system. So yes, I want to stay in touch. So how do we stay networked? Now, since then, it has grown dramatically. There are 150 members. It is actually more global. And the biggest impact it's having is in philanthropy, which is so rewarding. Now, I did get off the board after being on that initial board because I really wanted to concentrate starting in 2017 on something which I thought was closer to home, which was an expedition to change the politics of the country. So starting in 2017, I have dedicated more of my activities. I continue to support Indiaspora. I continue to believe in the mission. And more importantly, at the end of the day, I don't know if people know this, but one of the largest sources of foreign exchange and investment in many countries across the world is money that comes from its diaspora in the other parts of the world. So initiating a project, for example, at USAID to track this, which is easily $200 billion a year that flows from US citizens, US residents to their countries of birth, okay? And thinking about whether, a lot of it just goes to pay people's bills. Your parents live, still in Somalia. You're sending them checks every month. But a lot of it can be directed into impact and investing. So there have been efforts by various groups to do that. Indiaspora leads that kind of thinking. How do you do cohesive, impact-based philanthropy and investing, but also how do you do it at home? So one of the major events, exciting things about Indiaspora last year, 2020, was the focus on feeding America. And the amount of money that the Indian diaspora raised just around the issue of food banks, feeding, and not trying to figure out nuts and bolts, just finding the right organizations and building it out. They started a campaign, which in Hindi, if translated, means eradicate hunger, and it's hunger mitao, which is eradicate hunger, basically. And they started to fund it. And literally, we had people writing, 6- and 7-figure checks to doing that. So you awaken, you organize, you network, good things happen. And that's the kind of organizations you want to be involved with.
Absolutely. In addition to chairing the Virginia Housing Development Authority Board, you served as a commissioner on President Obama's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. What were some of the objectives of that commission?
When I was asked to serve there, I did it with all the usual reluctance that I do getting into anything connected to government, which is, what do I have to give up to do this? Do I lose my independence? Because that I fight very hard for this ability to speak and be honest and say what I mean and say what I believe. And after realizing, no, this could actually be pretty good. It's called a special government employee status. You join as a commissioner and you can kind of pick your spots. The exciting thing about what happened with the Obama Commission was that it was focused heavily on the most important thing that affects Asian Americans, which is we have 38 different communities. And we did not know within those what the disparities were. So it's all well to look at this community and look at one portion of it and say, you guys are doing really well. And there was this misconception that because of the success of some of the immigrant groups in this, like Indians as an example, that we had this model minority. Everybody was doing well. Well, absolutely not true. So we wanted to bust that myth because within this, there's so many disparities. There's a poverty range within this group, APIs, from 6% in poverty to 28%. There's a group that just came that is struggling, that came as refugees. There's groups that came 100 years ago that have other language barriers and concerns and issues and lack of engagement and voter suppression. I mean, so the range of issues was huge. We picked up the issue that first and foremost, we need data disaggregation. We have to be able to tell who is doing well, who's not doing well, and then only then can you do something about it. So for example, there are communities within this that have significant health issues, diabetes issues, health issues, heart issues that are disproportionately affected. There are communities in the API community disproportionately affected, like Blacks and Hispanics, as an example in COVID. But you don't hear about it because it's generically, you look at the fact that there are 1 out of 5 doctors is, an API, 1 out of 12 nurses is an API. Everybody must be doing well. Not true. So our biggest mission was lift up the issues, make sure that these communities are organized and have access to government and its services, and help communities that need help, like the Native Hawaiians, who are trying to form their own self-government, like the Native Indians have over many years. If they, in fact, decide they do, how do they coexist with the state of Hawaii and the federal government? How do you create that relationship? So it turned out to be far more interesting. Most fascinating for me was meeting 20 other people from all over the country, most of whom I'd never met. And by the way, we have become fast friends. We've created networks. It's given birth to a major political movement in our community. It's because of that commission and the leadership of the people within it. So it served many purposes, but ultimately it has turned out to be for the good.
You have so many accomplishments. Is there any one that you feel is really special to you?
I get asked that question, and I honestly, not because I'm young anymore or, that kind of optimistic or otherwise, I don't believe in legacy. I don't believe you work to a legacy. I think you work for the future. So I have 2 grandsons. I have a 3.5 and a 1.5. And there are certain promises and commitments I think I'm making to them about what needs to be this country and this world when I leave it. And so if there's one thing that I have used the opportunity to talk about, it's housing as a fundamental right, as a human right, as something that everybody should have an entitlement to. That the belief system has to be that no matter where you are, no matter who you are, no matter your gender, your nationality, and so on, you should have the right to a safe, decent, and secure home. It's a promise that America made in the 1949 Housing Act. It's a promise that America has yet to keep. So if there is one thing I would like to leave, if I wish to point to, it is that I emphasize that as a basic, whether you are a renter, a homeowner, or a co-op owner, or whatever that structure is. If I've used the crisis of COVID to any purpose, it is to continuously demonstrate the importance of the stability of that anchor and the impacts that instability has. There is a pipeline of those that get evicted who become homeless, who lose a generation into poverty. It is completely and totally in America preventable. We must prevent it. We must enact not just good policy and the resources, but the empathy of people to make sure that that prevention takes place. So give me an opportunity anytime to talk about the importance of housing as a human right, and I will do so. The importance of prevention of generational poverty, and I will do so. And I think it all interconnects to doing good business and creating a better America.
Well, let's hope that that gets into the budget in a really important way at some time in the near future, because we're still struggling with the voucher program, which utilizes existing housing. And we're getting to the point where we really need some new construction going on.
Yes. Yeah, I think, the combination of three things actually can help address a number of problems, and they're all in, let's call it the thinking and the plans, okay? For what we hope is a new day with a new administration, a new Congress, a new energy about let's solve the problems of America now. Let's talk about what real needs exist and not about politics and division and discord and so on. So three things. First, the concept of universal housing vouchers. Those that need it don't need it forever, whether it's temporary or permanent, the ability to access it so that there is not this queuing up process and frankly, a very discriminatory process of who accesses it and who doesn't then. Number one. So that doesn't solve the production problem because you have to have housing for people to go into. Number two, let's expand our thinking about housing. We started to do that 10 years ago when we started thinking about single family homes as rental, okay? And being in every community. We started to think about that when we started talking about accessory dwelling units and the complete segregation that occurs when you have minimum 1 acre lots and communities that have no affordability and others right next door that have great demand and need. We started to work on those issues. I would like to see a universal set of principles established that focus on how does one utilize all available housing. Think of the Uber for housing that Airbnb has become, which is how do you take underutilized? If people own second homes, and by the way, 20 million do, they live in them for 2 months a year, that 10 months they're vacant, they sometimes rent it out periodically. How do you utilize underutilized existing infrastructure in a way that it actually helps the concept of increasing production? First. Second, you have to preserve the housing that exists that's already affordable. Finally, you have to construct new housing. So 2 ideas on that have come up. One is the notion of helping with down payment assistance, particularly to minority families to assist them in getting on the ladder, not only for home ownership, but to wealth building. Still, notwithstanding the rise in the stock market, less than 25% of Americans own enough in the stock market to make a material difference to their net worth. Only 10% really own enough to grow wealthy because of the stock market. So this emphasis on how's the stock market doing has nothing to do with Main Street. What does have to do with Main Street is safe, secure housing and appreciation in value. More than 60% of Americans rely on housing wealth for their main ability to transfer wealth to the next generation. So we need to encourage and grow that. Finally, if we don't do more with what already works, the low-income housing tax credit, the new markets tax credit, what we're creating with down payment assistance in home ownership, and the ability to change zoning and land use laws so we can build more affordable and mixed income, then we will have failed as a nation. So one of the roots of segregation in the United States and racial injustice is housing. The federal government encouraged, supported, and overtly caused it. We therefore have a higher obligation than almost any other major sector in the United States to solve this problem. And I think that's what we should be about, is address the root causes of segregation and create integrated communities where all people can enjoy the appreciations of neighborliness, home wealth gathering, and a safe, secure home to live in. I do think this is possible, Ned. I'm a dreamer for a moment here, but I do think it's possible.
With COVID, the economy, tense race relations, and climate change, what do you see for the future?
I hope we've learned the importance of family. For a long time, I used to hear my American friends tell me a joke like, can't wait for that young guy or that daughter of mine to get out of the home. It was a standard kind of practice joke you did in a cocktail party. Say, oh my God, they came back home again. And I used to always think, and maybe it's just cultural, we never felt that way. My wife and I loved it when our child came home. We love it when our grandkids come. We actually look forward to it and think of it as the highlight of what we do. So, it's amazing how many of my friends have turned around and said, this is not a bad thing. We've learned to eat dinner together again. We've learned to talk, negotiate, compromise, and work together because it's been necessary for all of us to be together, you see? So this is an important lesson. I think it's a major cultural change in America if family becomes important again and it becomes the preeminent reason we exist rather than a secondary reason. And this notion of individuality is important, but it can carry to a fault, to be blunt. Okay, so with that little soapbox-ish, the main thing COVID taught us, it's taken, just think of you have a wound. What you did with it was you covered it up and you put a Band-Aid over it. And you had that wound for 400 years. Just in the last 50 years, you thought, hey, you know what? It's actually healing underneath. And then you rip that Band-Aid off suddenly, and you see what's exposed underneath, and you realize you've made really grossly insufficient progress. And that is the truth of racial injustice, particularly as it relates to the Black community. The bottom line is that in 50 years, we have not changed the fundamental wealth equation between Blacks and whites. We have not changed the home ownership equation dramatically. And we have to ask ourselves, was it because we didn't spend enough trillions of dollars? Or was it societal and cultural? Or was it some combination of both? And it is both, right? We have not changed our attitudes enough. We still have elite schools that are still disproportionately white and sometimes disproportionately Asian. It's because we haven't given enough opportunities to others, whether they are Blacks or Hispanics or women. We now have a crisis where 20 to 25% of the women in the workforce may have to drop out for a while because they couldn't find daycare that was affordable. And this crisis has extended itself into 21 and probably well into the second and third quarters of 21. So you take all of that together and you say to yourself, we have these problems, my dear. We have them. And maybe it was George Floyd and you had to unfortunately see that tape. Maybe it was Black Lives Matter and you unfortunately had to deal with that sort of head on. I don't know. I personally conclude that the biggest single thing that's happened is when awakenings happen, solutions come up. They must be big, they must be bold, they must take time. I think, for example, we can create 5 million new Black homeowners in the next 10 years. We have a plan, can be done. We actually think we can dramatically affect through things like we described earlier with Remergent communities, the integration of mixed income housing in smaller towns and creating more affordable housing in other places outside of the major metros. I think we can also more dramatically have an impact directly on women in the workforce by figuring out the home to work equation much better. I like the idea that people have the flexibility, but then they need these other support systems. They need the support system of community, of daycare, of affordable. So the idea that we can actually legitimize childcare and early education as professions, pay them a decent wage, create 1 million new jobs, which could be women or men or whatever, I don't care, but legitimize professions that have become incredibly important to the growth of this economy and for the productivity of everybody in the workforce. So housing is an element of it and is a critical element, but it's the place where all these things can happen. But I don't think work from home is going away. I think it becomes a bigger part of what people do now. And if it is, then we need these support systems. So let's encourage and create the ecosystem of support within our communities and families that enables everybody to be as productive as they can. I think that's what we've learned in COVID. I hope we don't lose that lesson. I hope we don't just throw money at the problem, because it wasn't money alone. It was lack of social progress, cultural change, our own mindsets about what integration and community means. I think we maybe are growing out of that in America. I pray to God it is true.
I do too. And if we can just get our arms around the COVID vaccine and get everybody on the program, then maybe we can get kids back in school. And I think that's going to help women get back to work, probably more than just about anything else.
I think that's why we have to get kids back in school. Plus, I think just experiencing my own grandkids and my grandniece, my God, they need company. They don't need us adults around them all day alone. That doesn't work. They need stimulation. They need encouragement. They need teachers. You know, have we finally understood that teaching is the most important profession in the world? Have we finally figured that out? If we have, why aren't we encouraging it? Teaching people to teach, helping them teach better, creating an environment in which they are paid a decent wage with decent benefits. Look, America, just wake up. There are some professions, whether it is early childhood education. I think you've seen the research done by all parties, all academics, that says a child's brain is so formed by the age of 3, 5, and 8 that we should be providing universal pre-K to every child in this country, somehow, some way, in a highly developed manner, because it will dramatically spur America like a Sputnik into the next century. So the answer is we've learned a lot. I hope we don't forget the lessons completely. I hope we allocate resources well. But importantly, I hope we elevate certain professions into those that are of the most importance to us and our future.
Well, Shekar, I always love talking with you. You know, you're so intelligent and you have so many wonderful ideas and thoughts, and you're a humanitarian. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you, Nan. Appreciate talking to you and your audience. Thank you very much.